In 1970, Atlantic Records dropped this bombshell. Now, for less than £1, they handed out tracks from rock gods in the making. This wasn't just a sampler, it was a who's who of rock royalty, wrapped in one dusty little LP. Clapton, Zeppelin, yes. All before they took over the world, and you could buy it for 99p. Let's crack it open, shall we, and take a look. So back in 1970, the music industry was at a turning point. The psychedelic 60s were giving way to harder-edged rock, more sophisticated arrangements, and a greater emphasis on albums over singles. Now, record labels, especially in the UK, they were grappling with how to promote emerging artists in rapidly expanding scene. Now, enter the sampler album. It was an affordable way for labels to push multiple artists at once. For example, for just 99p, the Age of Atlantic offered listeners a ticket into the future of rock music, a peek behind the curtain of what would become really a cultural juggernaut. It became a musical time capsule of the late 60s energy, colliding with the bold experimentation of the 70s. So side one opens with Delaney and Bonnie's Coming Home. This is a soul-infused rocker that featured Eric Clapton, no less. His involvement with this project signalled a transition from supergroup Blind Faith to more roots-based explorations. The track reflected that shift, with Clapton turning away from power trio pyrotechnics towards some soulful southern fried rock instead. Critics were warm but cautious. Melody Maker called the duo of Delaney and Bonnie Bramlett a spirited but uneven combination, but with Clapton's involvement it kept eyes firmly fixed on them. Now, behind the scenes, however, Clapton was already sketching out what would become Derek and the Dominos, so it was only ever going to be a short-term collaboration. It was an ideal album opener though, passionate, tightly arranged and really instantly gripping. Track 2 was the MC5's Tonight, which was full of raw, political, Detroit-style rock. Now, these guys brought the garage scene into revolution. Their debut, Kick Out the Jams, had turned heads in 1969, but their second album, Back in the USA, released just before this sampler went out, really divided the critics. Now, some loved the lean, fast-paced production, thanks to John Landau, but others, including the band themselves, felt it muted their live power. But still, their inclusion on this LP gave UK audiences a glimpse of America's proto-punk underground. It was aggressive, unapologetic, and probably the most incendiary cut on the whole of this record.
Get moving! I gotta rustle me up some action. Well, I'll see you all later.
Now, track 3 featured the Allman Brothers Band with Black-Hearted Woman. Now, this capturing the swampy, blues-soaked southern rock that would soon explode with their live album at Fillmore East. But in late 1970, they were just beginning to crack through. Their second album, Idle Wind South, had recently dropped and was building up quite a bit of momentum. Duane Allman's reputation as a slide guitarist was soaring, thanks in part to his work with Eric Clapton on Layla. Southern rock hadn't yet become a label, but the Allmans were defining its very DNA. The critics were intrigued. The Rolling Stone hailed their blend of jazz, blues and rock as a sophisticated southern stew. Tasty. And then the next track was Yes's Survival. Now, this was an early cut that showed a band beginning to stretch beyond really conventional rock into progressive territory. Survival was a prime example of really what their early experimentation was all about. complex arrangements, soaring vocals, and that sense of symphonic ambition.
So soon the evening comes, with it runs the aching fear.
And while the UK press found them promising, few could have predicted they'd become giants of prog just a year later. But the pieces were slowly falling into place. Not yet the bombast of Close to the Edge, but the ambition was really quite clear. Now, it's impossible to talk about compilations without pausing for Led Zeppelin. Now, they featured twice on this album. There was Whole Lot of Love and Communication Breakdown. By 1970, their stock was already rising and fast. But this sampler still marked a key distribution moment for curious listeners who hadn't really yet bought into the hype. Now, A Whole Lot of Love is pure swagger, a distilled summary of rock's shift from blues covers to riff-based dominance. What was more significant is how this track was such a contrast next to lesser-known acts. It gave listeners context. You didn't just hear Zeppelin, you understood why they were important because they stood out.
Way down inside.
Now let's step back a moment at this point and consider just what Atlantic Records' intent was here. What were they getting out of it? Now, this wasn't a random assortment of bands or indeed music. What it was a strategic music marketing act, really in its purest form. The LP was sold at a loss, or near it. The point wasn't profit, it was exposure. Labels in the 1970s were building long-term careers. Getting someone to spend 99p to try 10 new artists? Well, that was just a bargain. And if it led them to buying in The Court of the Crimson King or Yes His Time in a Word, well, that's really where the real money was. In a way, the age of Atlantic was the Spotify playlist of its day. Only instead of skip buttons, you had grooves and a turntable arm. Now, beyond the household names, this LP offered exposure to acts that hadn't yet broken through globally, but had already a degree of a loyal cult following. Take Coldblood's I'm a Good Woman as an example.
But hey, I'm a good woman. I'm a good woman.
And this was a fiery funk rock cut fronted by Lydia Pence, whose vocals rivaled Janis Joplin's in sheer force. Well, there's Dr. John's Wash Mama Wash, a track steeped in New Orleans mysticism. It gave British listeners something entirely different from the blues rock explosion that they were swimming in. Even Iron Butterfly's Termination, though they were often written off as a one-hit wonders thanks to In Agada Davida, proved here that they were capable of more textured, concise songwriting.
This is termination, the outcome of your life.
These inclusions round the record's textual variety. This wasn't just rock, this was rock, blues, soul, psychedelia, proto-metal, and progressive experiments, all fighting for space on a single disc. And then there's also the artwork to consider, even including an iconic gatefold sleeve featuring a surreal plasticine collage of Hamish and Gustav. It's playful, strange, and packed with visual references to each band, really like a warped Sgt. Pepper cover, with more amp stacks and fewer moustaches. And the design reinforced the idea that this was more than music, it was a time capsule, a cultural artifact that made the idea of musical discovery feel really quite fun again. This was music as exploration, and that's something really modern platforms, for all their convenience, often fail to capture. So, What was hiding inside this 99p vinyl gem? Well, it was a generation of legends, a label's blueprint for the future, a sonic crossroads where blues met prog and soul brushed against psychedelia. It was a map, it was a launch pad. It was a gamble that paid off, not just for Atlantic Records, but for every listener who dropped the needle and found something they didn't really expect. Now, in today's world of algorithmic playlists and instant skips, the sampler album feels like a lost art. But back in 1970, this one record quietly shaped the sound of the next decade. Now, if you find a copy of The Age of Atlantic in your local record store bin, buy it. Not because it's rare, but because it's a reminder of really how music discovery used to feel. Now, if you've enjoyed this dive into a truly underrated piece of rock history, hit that like button to show our algorithm that you did enjoy this video. And if you got a favourite track from this LP, or another great sampler album you'd like me to have a look at, drop it all in the comments. I do read them all, as you know. I've covered lots of Led Zeppelin albums and tracks on the channel, and the one I want you to watch next is here, and I'll see you over there.